So as part of our International Museum Day newsroom, we thought it would be really important to catch up with someone who's incredibly important locally and regionally, talking about what they do. And it's been wonderful over the last, particularly over lockdown, to talk to Claire. So I'm delighted that Claire Brown, the Regional Museum Development Manager from Museum Development East Midlands, has taken the time to join us. So thanks very much, Claire, for coming along for a chat.
That's all right. Very pleased to be here.
Good. So let's start. Before we get into what MDEM is, it's how are you? Have you managed to survive everything with lockdown? You know, we're a couple of days away now from museums being able to open again. Is it a busy time?
Yeah, it's a really busy time. There's been a lot of questions and queries about the reality of opening, the practicalities as much as anything, you know, managing visitors coming back. What does everybody expect? Will they come back? You know, all of that. But yeah, for a lot of places, it's been excitement really, because they've been closed for a long time. They've had a lot of issues. Those that need to earn money through opening have been chomping at the bit to get back open, and those that are volunteer led have had a lot of issues around whether volunteers will come back. You know, so they've been asking themselves questions about whether they can reopen in the same way that they did. So it's been a busy time, but it's great to see things changing for the positive now. That's a great thing to see.
Yeah, having spoken to you quite a few times over the last sort of 12 months, talking about the digital personas projects and all these kind of things that we've done with Leicester's White Heritage Project, which have been fantastic. It always seems to me that when someone's in your position, it's about you're managing an organisation. You've got the various forums and that you support, and there's the Heritage Awards recently, which was fantastic to see. Mm-hmm. And you're encouraging people to participate in training and come along to events and get involved, and you help people with all their kind of day-to-day structures and templates and stuff. And something like COVID comes along, which is completely out of the blue, completely out of the norm. I mean, actually, there is actually no way. I mean, we even said before we came on, didn't we? You said May's normally quite quiet, but it seems busier. It's because I think every deadline and anniversary we have now, it will be in different times. It was like this, but now in this kind of post-COVID or COVID coping world, it's very different. Do you feel that for the first time that you're using MDEM in a way that's actually quite good and interesting? It must be quite exciting at the same time, and I don't mean that in a kind of a horrible way. Yeah. Obviously, it's been a real challenging time, and people have died, and that is very, very serious. But suddenly, you're actually needed even more than before. So I mean, that must be quite a challenge for you to be able to rise to that, and then also with your staff as well, with your staff too.
Yeah, it is. Do you know, I think that is the right word, actually, even though there's been a lot of negatives and so on attached to COVID. But actually, what we found was as soon as lockdown kicked in March last year, we just had to completely rethink. We had to say, okay, throw out the business plan for next year, all the stuff we were going to do, and what is it that we need to do to react to support museums, because that's our role. We're there to support primarily accredited museums, but we will, support all museums as far as we can, in different ways and to respond to their different needs. And of course, what we were suddenly struck by was that the sector needed to flex, that we couldn't predict what they needed. So we started to rethink the fact that we have grants every year, we run small grants, and we wanted to repurpose those. So a lot of our programme funding went into grants that museums could suddenly apply for to think differently about what they were doing, because the initial couple of months were a bit of shock, a bit of like, right, we're closed. We've got staff issues. We can't afford to keep staff on, in the sense, we have to put them on furlough. All of that was new. All of managing that was new. People with volunteers were saying, how do we keep in contact with volunteers? How do we maintain that relationship so they're still interested? And then as it progressed, it became very apparent that it was going to go on longer than we all thought. So that started to impact on how we were supporting museums, because they needed to think about connecting with audiences while they were in this long period of closure. So it was about digital, working in a more remote way with people, but also with volunteers. You know, they had to think, how do we keep people engaged? A lot of people were shielding. Volunteers couldn't necessarily come on site because obviously there was social distancing. So a lot of our support went into helping museums to get a bit of money to set up new ways of working. So that might have been a new digital offer, improving their websites, starting to do things like online talks, just reimagining reinterpretation of collections online, you know, just things that they could do that would connect with audiences but would be a different approach. And that might have just needed a bit of investment. But then alongside that, we were running training online around things like engaging with schools, because that's a big area for museums and it can be an income area as well. So it was like, God, how do we suddenly keep this relationship with schools when they're closing and opening and all over the place as well? It was important for us to maintain that kind of relevant training and not just stick to a plan that we'd always had. But the other thing that I think was vitally important was networking. So for our sector, people do network quite well anyway. We have county forums, as you know. In Leicestershire, we have a really good Museums and Heritage Forum. But we needed more than that. We needed some specialist networks. So we set up a regional leaders network online, which was actually a bit of a moment for people in a leadership role just to offload, just to say to each other, aren't you having, you know, are you having the same issues? We've got, you know, most of our team on furlough, but we've got all this fundraising to do just to keep the organisation afloat. People were going for emergency funding that the government was offering. So they wanted to kind of talk to each other about what that meant, who was eligible, interpreting the criteria, all of that stuff. And then some of the other things that came out of COVID were around the fact that people weren't able to get to their sites, you know, so they weren't monitoring the buildings, they weren't doing that regular maintenance, they weren't monitoring their collections and the environments those collections were in. And so we've actually come out with things like pest infestations, because it was like a perfect storm for pests, you know. Let's be neglected, let's, you know, have dark spaces in stores with lovely museum objects and ephemera to eat, and the mild weather as well. So we've responded to that by setting up a pests network where people can share knowledge about how to tackle pests, and we've got our own expertise to feed into that. So yeah, it was literally throw out the plan and start to be responsive and flexible. That's really what we did.
I think that's lovely how you've encapsulated it there, because it literally is. It was like trying to make a plan on quicksand. There were no fixed points. I mean, you know, having put up tents in windy and rainy weather before, I realised you're only going to be successful when the first peg gets in, and then it's going to be solid. And we've got an entire sector, and I think you said at the beginning of your talk there about it being, you know, we had to flex, we had to be quite adaptable and think in new ways. And, you know, the old days of sitting around for a staff team meeting now, as I'm sure you used to do, with, okay, let's think about next year's plan. You know, anybody got any ideas about trends and spot what's coming down the road? And well, of course, this is something that's tested everybody everywhere in so many different ways, but affected everybody. So it's one of those things, I think, you know, to be able to even still be here, you should be proud of. As an observer, I think you're doing really well to still be here and be positive. But also, I mean, you've released yesterday your volunteering needs report for 2021. I mean, has that been very much informed by the impact of COVID over the last sort of 12 months, and how important volunteers are really to be able to return? Because I think when people come to venues, they expect a coffee shop or, you know, a little gift shop. They expect it to work and for it to be open without any real understanding that probably most of the people that they'll see and engage with won't be paid. They'll all be volunteers in some kind of capacity. It's really important with this sector in particular, the role of volunteers.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It was hugely informed by COVID, the report. And it was really because we were hearing directly from organisations about their worries over their volunteering workforce and how important it is to their capacity. And really, you know, what we did was we threw out a survey to museums just to get an idea of the impact on volunteering through COVID. And we were astonished, you know, by the response. We in 2 weeks, we had 80 museums across the region reply, of all shapes and sizes, you know, some with paid staff, a lot that were just totally volunteer run. And what shocked us the most was the statistic that 22% of volunteers are thought to have been lost during COVID. So that is a massive impact, as you can imagine, because you're absolutely right, John. You know, what people forget is that, you know, the National Trust has paid staff, you know, managers for sites, conservators behind the scenes, but a lot of front of house is actually volunteers. And that's the same for some local authority museums where you have volunteers helping to run events, but also the independent sector is hugely reliant on volunteers. And you know, in our region alone, we've got 4,000 plus volunteers working in museums and heritage sites just on our radar, which is the accredited museums. You know, so we've got 116 accredited museums in our region, the East Midlands as a whole, and you know, that's a huge number of people giving their time, and they really have a mixture of roles. You know, a lot of people do work on events and running cafes and shops, but you know, even just welcoming people at the door, or dealing with schools groups, or helping things to run behind the scenes, setting up exhibitions, doing the social media, you know, making things, doing research, you know, managing collections, documentation, all sorts of stuff. And if you lose a huge proportion of that, it is going to have an impact on the visitor, but also on the sustainability of that organisation. But one of the things we know about our sector is that the majority of those volunteers are older people. So the report has really exposed that need for museums to think about diversity, you know, and they've actually acknowledged that. And that's been great, because they've basically said, you know, we know that a lot of our volunteers were shielding or isolated during COVID, and that we couldn't get people on site anyway, but they've realised they need to adapt the offer. So, you know, they need to look at flexible forms of volunteering, whether that's micro volunteering opportunities where you just get a volunteer to come and do a specific task for you or a particular project, or offering remote opportunities so that you can attract different types of people who don't want to be on site, who don't want to travel, or who maybe live quite a long way away but are really interested in your museum or whatever it is, but you know, could do something remotely, whether that's, you know, helping with your marketing or your collections documentation or whatever it is. There's thinking about those diversity of opportunities that have come out of this, rather than, you know, the majority of volunteering opportunities up until COVID were on the site. So they expected people to be able to get to those sites, which immediately limits the pool of people that you can draw volunteers from. So the other thing, as I was talking about, you know, with age, is that also reflects in your audiences. So the plan that a lot of museums are now formulating is to think about how they bring young people in, not just to, you know, appeal to them as audiences and people to get through the door in that way, but to bring them in as volunteers so that they can adapt their offer to those young people, because young people aren't going to be able to, you know, work in a museum in the same way as other people, but they will then influence the direction of that organisation, because they'll bring in new thoughts, fresh ideas, and ways of thinking about how young people might want to engage with that museum. So it's a win-win if museums can diversify their volunteers. And COVID has just really kind of put a focus on that need to think differently, and how it's not just about the workforce that influences, but it's about the whole organisational approach.
Great. Well, that leads me perfectly to my final question for you, really, with our conversation, is the fact that this year's theme for International Museum Day is Recover and Reimagine. And obviously, after this disruption, the great disruption of 2020, 2021, the sector will have to, yes, recover, reopen, and all of the challenges that we've got there with being able to present the museum at its best, your museum as a volunteer in a way that also people want to come back to, because if they do come along and support it, they expect their cafe to be open if it was open last time, or the children's play area to be open if you're known for your children's play area. In 5 years' time, do you think we will look back, people in the sector, specifically, let's talk about the museum sector, do you think people will look back and turn around and say, we actually do things better now because we were forced to engage a new way of looking at volunteering, rather than it just being a traditional thing, which was like a book of volunteering opportunities? We had to reimagine it. We had to think about where our audience was from. Maybe we could go from being a local museum to an international museum by engaging social media more. Do you think generally there will be a thought that in 5 years, when they reflect back, it was a good time? It's helped the sector to keep going, because again, there's always that struggle, isn't it, about where the money's going to come from and stuff. Do you think it'll be seen as a positive thing?
Yeah, I really do, John. I think it has just pushed people forward, fast-tracked the whole sector in a lot of ways that people have talked about. Even the kind of working from home thing, where we've all said for years, we were talking about how we didn't need to meet in person all the time. We could do things on Zoom or Teams or whatever. But it was always this blocker because not everybody had done it before and all of that kind of thing. And I think that's the same for this sector, is that sometimes there was that sense of we haven't tried that out before, so we're a bit reluctant. We're quite a risk-averse sector. But yeah, I think people will look back positively, because they had to move forward. They had to be fleet of foot to apply for the funding that was available, because some organisations were about to tip over and fall off the cliff, if they didn't get some emergency money that was available. And they've done that. They've proved to themselves that they can do that kind of fundraising. Some museums have had to really pick up their branding. They've had to sell themselves, get out there, be demonstrating, to different audiences that they're relevant. And I think that's the word I always focus on: relevance. Museums have to be relevant to survive. And this whole period of time has made them, in a lot of senses, revisit that, rethink about who they're for. And I think that's because they've been thinking, well, how can we reach people differently? We might have traditionally run a series of events and exhibitions at a site, but actually, how can we do that differently? How can we start developing things online? How can we have more conversations through that online engagement? How can we be attractive when we reopen? Who are we wanting to get through the door when we reopen? Because the audience has changed. You're not necessarily going to get your international tourists coming to see, Royal Crown Derby collection, but you might then start thinking, well, who is the audience? I need to make this collection and the stories relevant to a local audience or a family audience, or young people who can find something in this, but maybe that's through a different approach and a different thinking. So I think it has completely fast-tracked, not only rethinking the purpose of museums, but also some of the benefits of using technology, and the fact that we can do it rather than always being a bit reluctant.
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of resilience will come out of it as well. And maybe I shouldn't have asked you about 5 years. Maybe I was just thinking about both of us being able to answer that question in 5 years' time, because we're still be around. But maybe in 100 years' time, historians will look back and say, actually, the great disruption of 2020-21 was in fact that a lot more things survived in a way that was, they started thinking about their relevance rather than a badge of honor of still being there and surviving. The need to collaborate, the need to communicate why they existed, stuff like that. Thinking creatively. How are we going to critically think about the way that we do things? How would they change? I think this has made people address some of those things that were maybe fringe, which is, shall we have Instagram? Yeah. to actually now being vital, because it's the only way we can show people our collections now, because we've not been open. Exciting times, really, but also, like I said, challenging, and people losing their jobs, and 22% of volunteers being lost will have an impact on some organisations. But hopefully, on the whole, it will be building back in a much better, stronger way, do you think?
Yeah, totally. I think you're absolutely right. And I thought it was really interesting what you said about building audiences more in a more dynamic way, even, you know, in an international way, because there's a couple of museums in our region. One is Eam Museum, the Plague Village in the Peak District, who had not really a lot of social media engagement and really didn't do a lot online, but they got a grant from us and they developed some ideas, and they had a lot of interest from the media, being a plague village during a pandemic. So, you know, they had the history of the plague came to Derbyshire through a tailor from London bringing it during the plague in London. And
did he bring the London variant?
Yes,
oh,
yes,
okay,
absolutely. And then how they isolated so that it didn't spread, and all of this, they've got all that history and all the tragic stories about, you know, the impact to the village and the people in it. But, you know, the media interest internationally was enormous. So they really built on that by developing their social media, by making their talks accessible, by bringing in conversations across countries and across places and institutions to talk about, you know, the common history. And it's just been enormous, you know, the shift from this tiny little museum to having, you know, having a very local relevance to suddenly having an international audience, but not just waiting for someone else to do that, but actually embracing the opportunity and, you know, developing their online presence. But and also Creswell Crags is another one, you know, because they have the Ice Age story to tell with their prehistoric cave drawings. And, you know, they've again developed conversations and audiences with people all over the world. What a lot of museums are struggling with is how to make money out of any of that. So it's difficult, isn't it, when you create a service in a different way, where you haven't got a pay barrier, you haven't got somebody giving you money to do that. So that's a big issue. And when you talk about resilience, that will have to impact on decision making that organisations take, you know. But I do think the other thing that I won't forget to say is that how we run as museums should hopefully change as a result of this, because if you look at the future and, you know, how we'll look back and say what changed, I think for a lot of organisations, they've realised that actually having the same people running an organisation for 20, 30 years is not the most healthy thing always. It's about having the right people with the right skills, because the pandemic showed that actually for a lot of organisations, the board of trustees had to step up where it was an independent organisation, and there weren't necessarily the people who were willing to do the things that needed to be done to keep the organisation alive, to fundraise, to do grant applications, you know, to build profile for the organisation. It's having the right people and having a turnover of people that hopefully will shift as well, so that we get that new blood in, but we also have a bit more of a resilient approach to what skills we need to run organisations effectively.
And I'm sure if we speak again in a year's time, International Museum Day in 2022,
yeah,
some of that will have already started to play out, I think, because it needs to, isn't it? If it opens up again, it will start playing out. So just finally, your website, mdem.org.uk.
Yeah, it's a newly designed website. So
very nice, isn't it? Yeah.
Good. I hope you're going to say something good about it. But you're right, we're putting on our reports, and the other thing we do is we collect data about the museums in the region, break it down by county as well, so that you can get a snapshot of the economic impact of museums on the region, the number of volunteers, the number of people employed, that kind of thing. So we collect that on an annual basis, and that also informs our work, so we can pick out trends, you know, and we do a health check with museums as well every year, just to get them to start to identify their areas of need. So, you know, a big part of our role is constantly shaping our programming to respond to what those needs are.
Yeah, I guess it's also saying to people, your museum needs you, go and visit, you know, because it's either put some money into it, or maybe they need you because they don't realise the skills that you have, because they're now for the first time willing to start embracing a volunteering opportunity in a very different way, which isn't you standing on the door you know, and doing that kind of stuff. It might be just the fact that, you know, as an accountant or a solicitor or whatever, you've got, you know, the interest of being on being a trustee, but also maybe just your way of doing things that you do with the local school or the scout group. Just think about, well, what can we do? I think all conversations are now back on the table, aren't they?
Absolutely, and I'm really glad you said that, because we've just been running a board succession planning program, and at the start, I think it's 5 or 7 museums, I think it's 7, all started off saying, this is really difficult, we've tried for years to recruit new people, but actually through a process of going through with them, well, what do you need? What do you really need? What roles do you need to fill? What skills do you need? What backgrounds do you need? What thinking do you need? It's not about going to people who are interested in the history of the town that the museum is focused on. It is about those other skills, you know, and people who are enthusiastic enough to give a bit of the time, but they've got maybe a background in finance or management or business or teaching or whatever it is. It's yeah, legal is a big one, but it's looking for that diversity of skills, and again about that diversity of input of views. So, you know, finding a way. One of the biggest problems with boards, I think, is they have a traditional way of meeting and communicating with one another, and COVID has again shifted this, because they've all had to meet online, so they've become more efficient in their meetings, they've been a bit more flexible about when they meet, and that's much more attractive if you're younger, if you've got a family, you know, if you've got caring responsibilities of any kind, or you just don't want to meet in the evenings and go out of a winter's night to kind of go to some dark place and meet, you know. It's I'm not generalizing, but you know what I mean. It's about thinking about, if you're going to get the right people, you've got to be flexible to what their needs are too, so changing the culture a bit.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Claire, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. Like I said, it's I know it's a busy time for you, not normally, but it's a busy time for you in 2021.
Yeah, nice month.
Yeah, and wish you all the best. And hopefully, like I said, you know, we can plan to do this in a year's time and just keep doing what you do. But I mean, your Twitter, you know, MUSDVEM NewsDev East Midlands is a great source of information for anybody. And obviously, check out the new website for you guys with the branding and that, and brilliant. And certainly promoting the report to people. I think that's certainly something that Tina and I will do here at the Dot Media Centre to, you know, keep supporting whichever way we can. And fingers crossed, the sector starts building itself back.
Brilliant.
Keep doing what you're doing, please.
Yes. Well, if the Arts Council keeps funding us, we will.
We need a campaign to lobby the Arts Council to keep.
We're as reliant on funding as everyone else.
That's it. Okay, people don't realise that kind of thing either, do they? They just assume it's there and they take it for granted that it's going to survive forever.
No, well, that's right. We're very, very grateful to Arts Council for recognising the value of museum development, and they use us a lot. They consult with us, and the big thing that people don't see is that actually we're able to inform their policy decisions and their funding by saying what it's like on the ground, you know, what's the reality of the situation in the East Midlands, so that they're not just producing stuff that is irrelevant for the sector. So yeah, that we do have another role to kind of advocate back up. So
I guess everybody's got a role to play, haven't they? They don't. It's not just go and visit. Sometimes it's talk about it, and it be an ambassador for your local museum. I encourage you,
advocacy
for people to
massive.
visit.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, thanks very much for taking the time.
That's all right. Thanks, John.